At nearly 3 a.m. in the middle of a storm, I saw my own grandson and his wife digging a grave in my rose garden. That single sentence should be enough to chill anyone to the bone, but for me, it was the horrifying truth I witnessed with my own eyes. The metallic clang of a shovel striking wet soil echoed against the pounding rain, each sound like a drumbeat of betrayal. Through the narrow slit of my bedroom curtain, I watched a wooden chest sink into the earth my late husband once cared for with love. And there they were, Daniel the boy I had raised as my own, and Sophia, his wife, burying something with frantic, guilty hands, their faces twisted with fear, like criminals caught in their own shadows. Before I take you deeper, I want to pause. If you're watching this, tell me, where are you in the world tonight? Seattle, New York, or somewhere far away? Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear them. And if you've ever stumbled upon something in your own family that didn't feel right, let me know. Don't forget to subscribe, because what I discovered after that stormy night was darker and more devastating than I ever imagined. My name is Helena Donovan. I am 72 years old, a retired literature teacher, and I've lived most of my life in an old estate on the outskirts of Seattle. This house has been my sanctuary, my burden, my battlefield of memory. After my husband died, I thought the greatest storms of my life had already passed. But that night, lightning illuminated a truth that turned my world inside out. The child I had carried home from an orphanage decades ago, the boy I promised to protect, was now the man conspiring against me under the cover of darkness. I pressed my trembling hand against the cold glass, fighting the scream clawing its way up my throat. Daniel, once the orphan I vowed to love as if he were flesh of my flesh, bent low over the dirt like a man possessed. His shoulders hunched. His eyes darted, his movements sharp with panic. Sophia stood close, whispering, urging him to move faster. The shovel struck again, loud, merciless, like a gavel pronouncing judgment over my life. Then lightning flashed once more, and I saw something else. At the far edge of the garden stood Harris, my gardener, for nearly 30 years. His umbrella shook in the wind, his gaze locked on the scene. He had witnessed it too. But instead of stepping forward, instead of calling out, he slowly turned, retreating into the rain as though silence were safer than truth. A chill seeped into my bones, colder than the storm outside. I knew then that I was standing at the threshold of betrayal. The two people I trusted most had become strangers, desecrating the roses my husband once planted as symbols of devotion. And the question that would haunt me until the morning was merciless. What had Daniel and Sophia buried beneath my roses, and why did their secret feel like the end of everything I thought I knew about love and family? The storm ended, but its shadow lingered in my chest. I barely slept, pacing the cold wooden floors of my bedroom until dawn painted the sky in pale gray. Every crack of thunder from the night before replayed in my mind, echoing with the image of Daniel and Sophia's frantic hands pushing that chest beneath the roses. I knew I couldn't let the day pass without uncovering the truth. When Harris arrived with his lawnmower, I greeted him on the porch, my voice steady, though my insides trembled. "Cut the back garden today," I whispered, "and make it loud." His weathered face tightened, but he nodded, understanding more than my words conveyed. While the roar of the mower filled the air, I slipped to the rosebed shovel in hand, my heart pounding as though it wanted to leap out of my chest. The soil was softer than usual, disturbed, freshly scarred by betrayal. My hands shook as I dug each thrust, tearing away layers of trust that had once bound my family together. And then the dull scrape of metal against wood. I froze. With trembling fingers, I clawed the earth away until the outline of the chest appeared. My breath came in shallow bursts as I pulled it free. The lock had already been broken. Inside lay papers neatly stacked, yet dampened by the storm. My eyes widened as I recognized the first document, my original will. The ink of my name glared back at me like an accusation. Beneath it, property deeds, 3 townhouses in my name, now smeared with soil. These documents should have been in my safe, hidden behind a combination only I knew. My pulse hammered. Someone inside this house had violated not just my privacy, but my very sense of safety, and then tucked between the deeds, an envelope. The handwriting stopped my breath. My husband's. A letter sealed yellowed with age, addressed simply Helena. My hands trembled so violently I nearly tore the flap. Inside, his words spilled across the page like a voice reaching from the grave. He wrote of his failing health, his fear that he might not have the strength to protect me after he was gone. He warned me to be cautious, to watch Daniel closely, not because he was evil, but because he was vulnerable. Sophia has her own ambitions, he had written, and I fear she sees our Daniel not as a man, but as a key. The ink blurred through my tears. My husband had seen what I refused to believe. His last attempt to warn me had been buried, stolen, hidden beneath the earth. But there was something more. Folded inside the letter was a faded photograph. A young woman, unfamiliar, her eyes hauntingly similar to Daniel's. The edges were frayed, the back scrawled with a name I had never heard before. My stomach clenched as though the ground had shifted beneath me. Who was she? Why had my husband kept her picture with his final words? The chest was no longer just a box of stolen papers. It was a coffin of secrets, each page another nail driven into the story I thought I knew about my family. As I knelt in the mud, clutching the letter to my chest, one truth pressed harder than the storm outside ever. Had the people I trusted most were not who I thought they were. And worse, my husband, even in death, was still trying to tell me something I had failed to hear. The letter slipped from my trembling hands and landed back in the chest, its edges smeared with mud. I pressed my palms against the damp earth, trying to steady myself, but memories began crashing over me like relentless waves. That photograph, that warning in my husband's handwriting, it tore open old wounds I had tried so hard to keep stitched closed. I remembered the day Daniel came into my life. He was only 3 years old, standing alone in a crowded orphanage, his clothes too big for his tiny frame, his eyes wide with fear. His parents had died in a shipwreck off the coast, swallowed by the sea in the dead of night. When I knelt down and held out my arms, he hesitated for only a moment before clinging to me with desperate strength. From that moment on, I promised him he would never feel abandoned again. I poured every ounce of love into raising him. My husband and I never had children of our own, but Daniel filled that void with laughter and innocence. Birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, I carried him through them all. Even when the world reminded me he was not of my blood, I silenced it. To me, he was my blood, my heart, my family. After my husband passed, the silence in the house was unbearable. It was Daniel and Sophia who began showing up more often. They brought groceries, cooked dinners, even sat with me by the fire, pretending to be my comfort. At first, I thought it was love. I thought they were afraid to leave me lonely. But little by little, the mask slipped. Sophia's voice would carry through the kitchen, soft but sharp. It must be exhausting keeping up this old house at your age. Daniel's eyes would flick to hers, a silent exchange I wasn't supposed to notice. Once over tea, Sophia laughed lightly and said, "Have you ever considered how peaceful life could be in a retirement community? Activities, nurses, people your own age." Her words lingered in the air like poison perfume, sweet on the surface, deadly beneath. Now, holding my husband's hidden letter, I realized he had seen what I refused to admit. Sophia's influence was not gentle care, but calculated control. He had sensed her ambition, her quiet ability to weave herself around Daniel like ivy choking a tree. He feared that Daniel's loyalty to me could be bent twisted until it snapped entirely. The weight of it crushed me. It was not only my grandson's betrayal I faced, but my husband's silence in his final days. He had carried this fear, written it down, but never spoken it aloud. He had left me in the dark, perhaps hoping I would never need to know. And now, too late, his warning surfaced from beneath the soil. Kneeling there in the mud, chest heaving, I felt a grief so sharp it was almost physical. The child I had saved from loneliness, the man I had trusted with my legacy, was no longer mine. The love I gave had been twisted into weakness. And the man who once swore to protect me, even beyond death, had left me unprepared for the storm now raging inside my own home. The days that followed blurred together, but the weight of my husband's letter never left my chest. His words were like a lantern in the dark, painful glaring, and impossible to ignore. I began to watch more closely to listen between the lines of what Daniel and Sophia said, and it wasn't long before the cracks in their masks began to show. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when they arrived earlier than usual. Daniel carried his easy smile, the one that used to melt my heart, but now felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. We sat in the living room, the fire flickering, when he cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Mom," he began, his voice steady but too rehearsed. "This estate is too much for you. The taxes, the upkeep, the repairs, it's bleeding you dry. You shouldn't have to live with that burden." Before I could even answer, Sophia slid closer, her tone dripping with practiced sweetness. "He's right, Helena. I've been looking into some wonderful communities nearby. They have nurses on staff activities every day, even gardens where you can plant your roses again. You'd have companionship, safety, peace. Peace." The word felt like acid on my tongue. They weren't offering peace, they were building a cage lined with flowers. Their words wrapped around me like silk, but underneath I could hear the iron clank of chains. I forced a smile, nodding slowly, but inside every nerve screamed. They had rehearsed this. The way Daniel set the stage, the way Sophia smoothed the edges, it was a performance, and I was their audience of one. I excused myself early, retreating to my bedroom where I let my mask drop. Alone, I clutched my husband's letter, whispering to his absent spirit, "You were right. They're coming for everything." But the betrayal was not theirs alone. A week later, while in town, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. Near the cafe behind the hedge of flowering shrubs, Sophia's voice carried on the wind. She was not speaking to Daniel. She was speaking to Evelyn, my late husband's estranged sister. Evelyn, who had once fought me bitterly over the estate after my husband's death. Evelyn, who had called me an outsider unworthy of Donovan blood. There she stood, her hair sharp silver, her posture stiff as a crow on a branch, listening intently as Sophia murmured promises I couldn't catch. But I heard enough. A fair deal. Once the house is sold, you'll have your share. My stomach clenched. It wasn't just Daniel and Sophia weaving this web. Evelyn, too, had her claws in it. She had always wanted my home, the land, the legacy. And now she had found allies in the very people I had loved the most. I stood frozen, the sound of my heartbeat louder than their whispers. The storm was no longer hidden beneath roses, it was spreading, pulling in old enemies, resurrecting past wounds. And I knew then, with painful certainty, that what I faced was not a simple betrayal, but a conspiracy. One that had been carefully sewn together thread by poisonous thread, while I had been too blinded by love to see the tapestry forming around me. The image of Sophia whispering to Evelyn haunted me for days. Their voices still clung to my ears, even when I closed my eyes. I no longer doubted what I was facing, not kindness, not family, but a coalition of predators circling their prey. Still, nothing prepared me for the night their true faces finally broke through their practiced smiles. It was a Friday evening when Daniel and Sophia came for dinner. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows against the dining room walls. I had set the table the way I always did, silver-polished china gleaming, yet the air felt heavy, brittle, like glass about to shatter. Daniel carved the roast in silence for a while, his jaw clenched. Then, without looking up, he spoke in a voice so sharp it cut the room in half. "Mom, enough stalling. If you don't sign the papers, the law will force you. You can't keep living here. It's over." The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. I stared at him. My Daniel, the boy I had once soothed through nightmares, now speaking to me like a conqueror demanding surrender. Before I could answer, Sophia leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine as if savoring the moment. Her smile was thin, predatory. "Helena, we're only thinking of your safety. At your age, accidents happen. One wrong step on those stairs, one mix-up with your pills. It could be tragic." She sipped delicately, her eyes gleaming with cruelty. "Wouldn't it be better to move somewhere supervised before something unfortunate occurs?" Her words slithered across the table, venom wrapped in silk. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. They weren't suggesting anymore. They were threatening. Unbeknownst to them, another pair of ears had caught their performance. Harris had been fixing the window latch just outside the dining room, silent as a shadow. That night, when they finally left, he knocked softly on my kitchen door. His face was grim, his eyes lowered as he handed me a small recorder. "I thought you'd want this," he whispered. I pressed play. The machine crackled, then Daniel's voice filled the air. "If you don't sign the law, we'll force you." Sophia followed her tone, casual but cold. At her age, accidents happen. Hearing it again outside the heat of confrontation made my blood run colder than the night storm had. It was undeniable, immortalized in sound. Not concern, not love, threats. I sat there long after Harris left the recorder, heavy in my palm, the fire reduced to embers. The walls of my home, once a sanctuary of love, felt like the walls of a trap closing in. For the first time, I understood the full danger I was in. This wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just greed. It was a plan that could end with me buried beneath the roses, just like the chest I had unearthed. And as I stared into the dying flames, one truth crystallized. If I didn't fight back, they wouldn't just take my house. They would take me. The recorder still hummed in my hand when I realized the truth. I had two choices: become their victim or turn into something far more dangerous. That night, as the house creaked in the wind, I whispered to myself, "They think I am weak. Let them." The very next morning, I made a decision that shifted everything. I packed a small bag and drove into the city to the office of the one person Daniel and Sophia never took seriously, my foster daughter, Maria Chen. She had lived with us for a time during her teenage years, a quiet girl who studied late into the night, invisible to Daniel's mocking eyes and Sophia's dismissive smiles. Today, she was Dr. Chen, a respected psychologist, her name etched in polished letters on the glass door. When she saw me, her eyes widened with worry. "Helena, what's wrong?" she asked, leading me in. For the first time, I let my guard fall. I told her everything: the chest in the garden, the stolen documents, the threats over dinner. By the end, her hands were trembling. "They're trying to strip you of everything," she said, fury sharp in her voice. "But they won't succeed. Not if we move quickly." Maria arranged for a full medical evaluation, under her supervision, documenting in ironclad language that I was of sound mind, capable and lucid. Every test, every signature was another nail in the coffin of their lies. And then she leaned closer, her voice low. "I know someone who can help, Jonathan Reed. He's handled cases of elder abuse before and won. Meeting Jonathan was like finding a lifeline. Tall, deliberate, with eyes that saw through pretense, he listened without interruption as I laid bare the storm consuming my life. When I finished, he tapped the table lightly. "They think you're defenseless. That's their first mistake. We'll use that against them." Under his guidance, I began to move my assets quietly. With trembling fingers, I transferred funds from accounts Daniel thought he knew into a hidden trust Jonathan had set up under a neutral corporate name. I also signed papers for a small apartment in a high-security complex downtown. It wasn't the sprawling estate of roses and memory, but it was safe. A fortress with cameras, guards and doors no amount of sweet talk could unlock. Yet my most important move was not financial. It was theatrical. I began to let Daniel and Sophia see exactly what they wanted: a confused, weary old woman. I let my hand shake when pouring tea. I repeated questions I had already asked. I forgot where I placed my glasses. And every time their lips curled in satisfaction, I hid a small smile. Because behind their laughter, I was recording. Behind their whispers, I was gathering proof. They thought the game was nearly won. They didn't know the rules had just changed. For the first time in months, I felt the faint spark of power returning to my chest. I was no longer prey. I was bait, and the trap was beginning to close. I had learned patience. I had learned silence. But now the time had come to use both as weapons. Jonathan, Maria, and I devised the plan with careful precision. I would give Daniel and Sophia exactly what they hungered for: the illusion of victory. And then I would tear the mask from their faces in front of everyone. We arranged a family meeting in the great hall of the estate. The pretense was simple: I had finally agreed to sign the papers to sell the house. Daniel arrived with his chest-puffed Sophia with that triumphant glint in her eye. Evelyn was there too, draped in her usual cold elegance, pretending she belonged. The oak table was laid with the documents they had pressed into my hands so many times before. Daniel slid them toward me, his tone dripping with false gentleness. "Just a signature, Mom. Then you'll finally be free of all this stress." My hand hovered over the pen. For a moment I let them see hesitation, frailty. Then slowly I set the pen down. My heart thundered, but my voice was steady when I pressed play on the recorder Harris had given me. The room filled with Sophia's laugh-cold mocking. "She's just a burden now, Daniel. Once we move her, the rest is ours." The sound echoed off the high ceilings. Daniel's face drained of color. Sophia froze. Her lips parted as if she had seen a ghost. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her composure cracking. I leaned forward, eyes fixed on them. "A burden after I raised you, Daniel, after I gave you everything I had." My voice shook, not with weakness, but with rage that had waited too long. Before they could speak, I slid photographs across the table, Sophia standing in the cafe garden, whispering with Evelyn. Their heads bent together, their hands clutching papers. The color bled from Evelyn's cheeks. "Do you deny this?" I asked, my voice like a blade. Sophia sputtered. "That's taken out of context." Jonathan rose from his chair, then calm and unyielding. "There's more. Much more." He placed a thick folder on the table with deliberate weight. "These recordings, these photographs, the sworn statements of Dr. Chen and Mr. Harris, they've already been filed with the court. Elder abuse conspiracy to defraud, attempted coercion. Every word you've said, every threat you've whispered, it's all there." Daniel's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the table. Sophia's composure shattered. She lunged toward the folder as if she could claw the evidence back into her hands. Evelyn, however, made no such show. She rose without a word, her chair scraping sharply against the floor, and slipped out the side door like a coward escaping a sinking ship. The silence she left behind was deafening. Daniel sat, rigid eyes darting between me and Jonathan. Sophia hissed curses under her breath, her mask of sweetness obliterated, and I felt the weight of years lift from my chest. For the first time, I was not the hunted. I was the one holding the torch, and they were trapped in the blaze of truth. The silence that followed Evelyn's departure was only the beginning. Within days, Jonathan's filings became headlines: "Couple charged with elder abuse and fraud." Daniel and Sophia were no longer schemers behind closed doors. They were defendants, their names dragged across the evening news. I sat in the courtroom when the indictments were read: conspiracy to defraud, attempted unlawful seizure of property, threats against an elder. Their polished appearances couldn't mask the fear pooling in their eyes. Sophia, once so careful with her smile, now trembled as the prosecutor replayed her own mocking laughter for the jury. Daniel sat hollow, his broad shoulders slumped, his hands bound by the consequences of his own betrayal. Evelyn, too, was not spared. Though she slipped away from my dining room like a thief, Jonathan's investigation had unearthed her correspondence letters, receipts, whispered promises of a cut in exchange for her silence. When her role was revealed, the Donovan relatives who once tolerated her turned their backs entirely. She became a pariah, her name spit out with disgust at family gatherings. But justice, while satisfying, was not the end of my story. It was only the threshold. After the verdict, I left the estate not in shame, but in choice. The apartment downtown that once felt like a fallback became my sanctuary. I filled the walls with canvases and paintbrushes, rediscovering the rhythm of color I had abandoned decades ago. At 72, I joined a local art circle, men and women my age survivors, in their own right. Together, we painted not just landscapes, but scars and rebirths. For the first time in years, I felt surrounded by people who saw me not as a burden, but as a presence. Still, I could not leave the old estate as a ruin of betrayal. With Jonathan's help and Maria's vision, I transformed it. The roses my husband once tended were replanted, blooming defiantly against the past. The halls where Daniel and Sophia plotted were remade into gathering rooms. I named it the Memory Tea House. a place where older men and women cast aside by their families could come together. There we shared stories over steaming cups, stories heavy with pain, but also threaded with resilience. I watched widows laugh again. I watched veterans sketch their pasts with trembling hands. I watched people who had been silenced find voices again around my table. The estate that nearly became my prison had been reborn into a haven. Sometimes when I walk the garden paths at dusk, I think of that stormy night when I first saw Daniel digging under the roses. The fear still echoes in my chest, but it is no longer the final note, because I learned that age is not defeat, it is defiance. I am Helena Donovan. I am 72 years old, and I have proven that growing older is not the end. It is the power to begin again, sharper, stronger, and unbreakable.